Hey everybody. So, we're approaching Thanksgiving. We're about a quarter of the way through the NHL season, and Thanksgiving really is the first major benchmark of the year. Where your team is at Thanksgiving is pretty important. There obviously some things change the rest of the season, but a majority of the teams that are in a playoff position at Thanksgiving end up in a playoff position at the end of the year. So, with that being said, I decided that today would be a good day to look at what the first round playoff matchups would be if the season ended today. So if the season was just over right now and we started playoffs, tomorrow night, these would be your first round matchups. So let's get right into it. In the Western Conference, you would have Nashville versus Colorado, Minnesota versus Winnipeg, San Jose versus Dallas, and Calgary versus Vancouver. In the East, Tampa Bay versus Montreal, Toronto versus Buffalo, Columbus versus Boston, and the Islanders versus the Rangers. So, let's start in the West and look into this a little bit. Nashville versus Colorado. Nashville is the 1 seed, Colorado is the second wild card. These teams met in the playoffs in the exact same playoff positions last season, where Nashville beat Colorado and moved on to the second round. This would be a really fun series. I'd love to see them meet up again, and I think there's definitely a chance that they could meet up again. It looks like Nashville's going to win the Central, at least to start the year it looks that way. And Colorado, they definitely could end up as the second wild card. So that could be a playoff matchup again, and I love when teams meet in the playoffs multiple seasons in a row. It builds rivalry, it builds hatred between the teams. Each subsequent series is usually more and more physical and more entertaining than the one before. I love when teams meet up over and over again, and Nashville versus Colorado, division rivals, that would be a fantastic series. As would Minnesota versus Winnipeg. Again, these teams met in the playoffs last year. The only difference is if the season ended right now, Minnesota would have home ice advantage over Winnipeg because they're the 2 seed and Winnipeg's the 3. Last year, this series was a lot of fun to watch. However, it was only a 5-game series. Winnipeg pretty much took it to Minnesota for most of the series. But it was a very, very physical series. It was a lot of fun to watch. There's a lot of animosity between these teams. That would only ramp up if they met again this year. So I hope that these are the 2 teams that meet again this year in the Central Division. Because, again, multiple years in a row, division rivals, it doesn't get any better than that. If they do meet again this year, I expect it to be a much longer series than the 5-game series it was last year. I think Minnesota is playing better than they did last year, and I think Winnipeg isn't as dominant as they were last year. So this would be a longer series and probably an even nastier series than it was last season. San Jose versus Dallas. Someone from the Central Division is going to go over and play the 1 seed from the Pacific because I think 5 Central teams are going to make the playoffs and only 3 Pacific teams. So if the season ended today, it would be Dallas that has to go over to the Pacific and play San Jose, who probably will end up being the 1 seed in the Pacific. That would be a pretty interesting matchup. I don't think it would be as good as the 2 Central Division matchups on an entertainment value scale, but I think it would be a pretty good series. San Jose would probably take it in 6 or 7. And lastly, your Pacific Division matchup would be Calgary and Vancouver. There's definitely a rivalry between those teams. Western Canada, not as good as Calgary versus Edmonton, but Calgary versus Vancouver would be a very fun matchup as well. Moving over to the East, you'd have Tampa Bay versus Montreal. Montreal is currently the second wild card. Tampa Bay is the first overall seed. That would be a pretty interesting matchup. I think Tampa Bay would handle Montreal rather easily as well. I like the matchups in the West a lot more than I would like the matchups in the East. Luckily, we still have 3/4 of the season to go for all this to change. But I do like the matchups in the West a lot, not so much in the East. Toronto versus Buffalo. Buffalo's been very good this year. They are a surprisingly good team. I just don't think they'd be able to keep up with Toronto. Goal scoring wise, I think Toronto would just flat out outscore the Sabres, and that would probably be a 5-game series, maybe a sweep. And not a very physical series at all, as neither of those teams are overly tough. Then you would have Columbus versus Boston. Columbus currently leads the Metro Division, while Boston is the first wild card. That would be a very defensive series, probably not a lot of goal scoring. Most of your goal scoring would come from the Bruins' top line, although Patrice Bergeron is injured right now. So if the season ended today, Boston would not have Patrice Bergeron for this series, which would be a problem, but they still have Pastrnak and Marchand. Krejci's playing better. Jake DeBrusk is starting to heat up. So I think Boston would end up winning that series over Columbus, probably in 6 or 7 games. And then lastly, the best Eastern Conference series, I think, would be this one between the Islanders and Rangers. There's just such a rivalry there. That would be a great matchup, and I would thoroughly enjoy if these teams actually did meet up in the first round of the playoffs. That would be a lot of fun to watch, and there would definitely be some animosity between those two teams. Maybe not right away in Game 1, but certainly as the series went on. So, not too bad. The Western Conference I like. If that ends up being the Western Conference playoffs, I'm perfectly A-okay with that. That is fine. The East I don't like as much. I think that there could be some better matchups. And obviously I think there's going to be a number of teams who are not in the playoffs right now who end up being in playoff position, especially in the Eastern Conference. There's no way Washington and Pittsburgh both miss the playoffs. I think Washington's probably closer to being a playoff team than Pittsburgh is at this point. But so expect one of these teams to get knocked out by Washington. With that being said, let's go through, and I'm going to go through each matchup here, and I'm going to put a check mark next to the teams that I think are guaranteed playoff teams. Definitely not guaranteed for their particular position right now. It's way, way too early to say that. But I'm going to put a check mark next to the teams that I think definitely make the playoffs. There's no way around it. They definitely are in. I would be shocked if any of these teams collapse to the point where they don't make the playoffs. So Nashville absolutely is a playoff team. Check mark next to Nashville. Minnesota and Winnipeg, definitely playoff teams. I don't think either of them drop out to the point where they don't make the playoffs. And San Jose is definitely a playoff team. I would bet $100 right now that San Jose wins the Pacific Division. I don't think there's really any other team that's going to challenge them for that. That's pretty much it for the West as far as guaranteed playoff teams. I think the rest of them, there's some chance, maybe a slight chance, but some chance of them being knocked out. In the East, Tampa Bay is absolutely a playoff team. They're going to the playoffs. They're one of the best teams in the league. Toronto is absolutely a playoff team. They're too good not to make the playoffs. Boston, I'm not going to put a check mark next to them right now just because of injuries. They're riddled with injuries right now. However, they're still finding ways to get points even with all these players out. They lost in overtime in Dallas, got a point out of that game. They just beat Arizona 2-1, got 2 points out of that game while missing a majority of their defense and Patrice Bergeron. So Boston, I think if they can keep getting points with all these injuries and then come back, once those guys come back, Bergeron, Chara, McAvoy, Carlo, Miller, once all these guys come back who are currently out right now, they're going to be a very dangerous team. But I'm not going to check mark them yet because these next few weeks without those players could be a huge problem. We'll have to see how they do it. Really, I think Tampa Bay and Toronto are the only guaranteeds in the East right now. The rest of these teams, I think all could end up knocked out. Well, no, I'm going to put check mark next to Columbus. Columbus they're a good team, and I don't know if they're going to do much in the playoffs, but they're going to make the playoffs. There's no one else in the Metro that's going to jump all the way up enough to knock them out. I don't see it happening. So I'd say Columbus is in. Now I'm going to go through and put an X next to the teams that I think do not end up in the playoffs. These are teams that are currently in a playoff position, but I do not think that they make the playoffs. And there's definitely and any team. These are going to be teams that I really, really don't think make the playoffs. Any team left without a mark next to them, it's up in the air. They could or they might not. It's up in the air. I think Vancouver is out. Vancouver, listen, they're a much better team, but they had a really good start. They've fallen back to 500 now. They're still young. They're still missing pieces. They don't have an elite defenseman. I don't trust their goaltending. Elias Pettersson has been fantastic, but he single-handedly is not going to get Vancouver to the playoffs. Vancouver is not a playoff team. They will be out by the end of the year. Other than that, I think it's really tough. I mean, Colorado definitely could be in or might not be. Dallas could make it, absolutely, or could get knocked out. But maybe a team like St. Louis has a good second half. Calgary's most likely in, but I'm not going to put. They're not guaranteed, I don't think, so I'm not going to check mark them. But they're most likely in. Montreal, I mean, that's just straight up. That's up in the air. Same thing with Buffalo. That is up in the air. They could get in. They definitely could not. I don't know. Boston, I'm lean. Boston's in a similar situation to Calgary. I really think they're a playoff team. I think they're going to get in, but I'm not quite ready to check mark them yet. And then New York, the Rangers probably don't get in, but they've been so much better than expected this year. No, the Rangers aren't going to the playoffs. They're a rebuilding team. They are not going to the playoffs. The Islanders very much could. The Islanders could end up in the playoffs if their goaltending holds up, but they've got the offense for sure to make it. So I would say Vancouver and New York are your teams that are in the playoffs right now that I don't think definitely don't end up in the playoffs. They'll get knocked out by somebody else. Other than that, I think Colorado, Calgary, Dallas, Boston, Islanders, Buffalo, and Montreal all have a chance to certainly be playoff teams, or they might end up out. We'll just have to wait and see how the season progresses for each of those teams. And then Tampa Bay, Toronto, and Columbus, I definitely see making it. And Nashville, Minnesota, Winnipeg, and San Jose will all be in the playoffs this year. I would be shocked if any of those teams don't make it. So that's what would be looking at if the playoffs started today. The playoffs do not start today. We still have 3/4 of the season to go, but that was still fun to look at, and we'll see how things change. This will be a fun video to go back and rewatch at the end of the year and see how much things changed from where they are right now. But Thanksgiving is almost here, a few days away, and we'll have to see how the rest of the season goes for all of these teams in the playoffs and all of the teams currently not in the playoffs. Who from the outside can work their way in? I'm thinking teams like Washington, Edmonton, maybe Pittsburgh. What's going on with Pittsburgh? What about Florida? There's a lot of teams on the outside looking in now that really need to start to pick up their play if they're going to get into a playoff spot. So with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links are down in the description below. If you'd like to further support this channel, the link to our Patreon is down in the description, as well as the link to our merch store. So if you're interested in some Off the Wall Hockey merch, definitely check that store out. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.